Hello, welcome to the Bible study. My name is Kent Philpott. This is program number 67, and it is the next to the last program on the book of Acts. So number 67, we are in chapter 27. We're going to be looking at the entire chapter. It's a lot of material. I'm going to be reading as rapidly as I can and making comments. This is it's like a travelogue, really. It's a story of how it is that Paul gets to Rome as told by the Gentile and physician of his day, Luke, the only Gentile writer of a Bible book. And so it's the story of a sea voyage, and one that didn't turn out so good. So we're going to look at three stories. Paul sails for Rome, the storm at sea, and the shipwreck. The shipwreck. Okay. So you can see that Luke has no idea that he is writing a book or a piece of literature that is going to be considered inspirational or spiritual. He's making a very clear account. And by the way, it's a very accurate one. Now let me say this. There's a guy by the name of James Smith, who in 1848, mind you, 1848, wrote a book called Shipwreck of St. Paul. And in that book, he describes that he redid the whole movement of Paul on boats that would have been similar. And he wanted to check what it was said, how Luke presents a very interesting, clear account as a seaman, somebody who was familiar with sailing in that part of the world, and that eastern part of the Mediterranean, Adriatic Sea, and so on, that would encounter the places, even he calculated the drift rates of a boat going, how many miles would be covered in a day floating adrift. And just a remarkable, and F.F. Bruce, one of my favorite commentators, says, this passage we're going to be reading, it has long been acknowledged as one of the most instructive documents for the knowledge of ancient seamanship. So here we are, and so Paul has appealed to Caesar. He had been incarcerated at Caesarea under the Roman governor Festus, and now Festus is sending him on to Rome by boat. And there are going to be a couple different kind of boats. One is a coasting vessel, hugged the shore, didn't get out in the open water much, and then a larger grain ship, which was able to withstand the more difficult conditions on the open ocean. So we're in chapter 27, beginning verse 1. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy. Now notice Luke is there. Luke is there. And again, he has no idea that people are going to be reading this and thinking, oh, this is Holy Bible stuff. He's just writing an account. The Bible is very interesting that way. You may have read other documents that people purport to be words from God or some angel or some kind of whatnot, and it's supposed to be very divine and supernatural, and it sort of reads really crazy. Very hard to understand and very spiritual sounding. The Bible doesn't sound that way. That's one of the indications that it in fact is a God-breathed Holy Spirit work. So when it was decided, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. Now, Julius would have been frumentari. The frumentari means grain. He was a centurion, that this was his job. There were probably a bunch of them, that they would periodically get food to Rome. They had to feed Rome. They had to keep the this rabble at Rome satisfied, and so the frumentari. It's interesting that the cohorts here, what they call a cohort, would have names. The legions, the Roman legions, the large Roman legions, were numbered, but these smaller groups were given names. This one is called the Augustan, or in some Bibles it will say imperial. Named Julius, another Julius. Holy cow, we keep coming up with these Juliuses. And again, based on very likely belonging to the same social, political grouping that Julius Caesar had established. Verse 2, and embarking in a ship of Adramatium, I can't pronounce it right. It was a seaport in Mysia, an island, was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia. We put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. Aristarchus mentioned here, won't be later, but he later becomes a co-worker with Paul, and so Luke just happens to mention him here. So this is a coastal ship, hugs the coast. 3. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends to be cared for. So Paul has made acquaintanceship with Julius and has earned his respect and trust. 4. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus. In other words, the island standing in front of the direction the wind was coming. In this case, from the northeast. We'll find out a little bit later. Because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, these would have been part of the southern, southeast part of modern-day Turkey. We came to Myra and Lycia. I should have brought a map, but we had a hard time finding a map that we could make work here for this program. But perhaps in the back of your Bible you can follow along and see some of these places. The other centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. Now this would have been a big grain ship. There would have been a whole bunch of people, about 100 foot long. This is a big deal, big boat. And so it just happens to find it. Now this is taking place, by the way, in late fall. In 59 AD, the fast, or the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, took place on September the 5th. And it was said that past September 15, navigating out in the open Mediterranean was not advised. There was a period that stretched from about the middle of September through March when sea travel in that region was not considered to be wise. So we sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Syrtis. You may forgive me for mispronouncing words, but I'm doing the best I can. And as the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone, coasting along it with difficulty. Now notice Luke's language. With difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. So here's the travelogue, like I said. Luke is just describing this trip. Not terribly exciting, interesting, but not terribly exciting, and certainly not very spiritual. Verse 9, since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous, and because even the fast was already over, again, the fast would have been September 5. I want to see if I got that right. Oh, I'm wrong. Not September 5, October 5. The fast is already passed. I mean, they're well past the September 15 date. You know, it's a wonder that Julius kept going. It's hard to know why, but he was going against all local navigation concepts. The fast was already past. Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I perceive." Now, this isn't a word from God here. This is not a word from God. Beware of anybody coming up and telling you, God gave me a word for you. I got one of those Sunday. Don't pay attention to that. Somebody comes up, God gave me a word for you. I have a sign for you. I have this. Say, okay, mail it to me or something. Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. Well, the first parts are right, but there would be no loss of life. So this is Paul's perception. Paul had been shipwrecked 3 times. He knew that area well. He had sailed on it many a time. Who knows? I mean, he was born right on the coast there, the southeastern coast tip of the Mediterranean. He was very familiar with it, very likely. Verse 11. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. Well, they got money to be made, and they want to get that place from Alexandria where they had the grain along the Nile Valley. It was very fertile, a lot of wheat grown, and then we're going to get it to Rome and get some money. And the pilot and the owner of the ship then said to them to what Paul said, and because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, which is now Phoenicia, called Bay, a harbor of Crete, on the island of Crete, called Phoenix, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. There's going to be a storm called the northeastern. It was like a typhoon, and so that anchorage in a harbor would have protected them. Now, the second story is called the storm at sea. Now, when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. Pliny the elder, you don't often hear from him, you hear from Pliny the younger, Roman people that wrote to Rome about the conditions. He used the term a typhonic wind. That's Pliny the elder, verse 15. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. This is what James Smith, in that book written in 1848, was measuring. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. Now, that would have been a dinghy. Now, it's a little detail here. It would have been like a life raft on board a larger craft, a smaller vessel that was used for who knows how many different things. But because of the wind, it was probably swinging and they were having difficulty, but they needed to secure it. And so Luke gives us this little detail. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. What they had were what we called cables. They were cables, and there would have been 3 or 4 of them perhaps, and they would loop them underneath. They probably threw them over the bow first, and they would literally tie the ship together, to keep it from breaking apart with the crashing of the waves. Then, fearing that we would run aground on the Syrtis, I think, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. They didn't have any sail up anymore. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. These people are desperate. And on the 3rd day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay in us, all hope of our being saved, was at last abandoned. They could not know where they're going. They didn't have compasses. They required on observing the moon and the stars and the sun to navigate. That was all done. Verse 21. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. Now that little statement about, I wish you should have listened to me, you don't know the tenor of the way Paul said it, whether it was a rebuke, a blaming, whatever, or just a straightforward saying you'd had to have seen and heard. But here's what he says in verse 23. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the Lord, to whom I belong and whom I worship. He doesn't worship the angel, he worships God, the God of the angel. Angel, by the way, means messenger. An angel is a messenger, that's all. And he said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told, but we must run aground on some island. Okay. Wow. Quite a story. Quite a story. I don't think I've ever seen a film that's been made, short or long, feature film or a short, on this. But it would be kind of interesting, I think. Anyway, here we come into a little bit, got a lot way more to go. When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. That would be a weighted line, every 6 foot marked out for a fathom, whatever it is. A little further, they took on a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. That's the difference between 37 yards first sounding and the second one 27 yards. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for dead to come. It's a little bit unusual to do it from the stern, usually from the bow, but they had a reason. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. Okay, just a story. I'm not going to continue much on that. They were trying to get away. These soldiers, they weren't sailors. They were soldiers that they were guarding the prisoners, different from the sailors. But for some reason, Paul says, no, they got to all be here. But he alerted them. How he knew? We don't know. Verse 33. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Now, I have a little hard time with that because they had to have been taking something. I think what he meant was we haven't had a real meal in a long time. In 2 weeks, we haven't had a real meal. And due to the tempestuousness of that northeastern typhonic wind, but in any case, he urges them to take food. Therefore, I urge you to take some food. It will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. There comes that old proverb, a hair from the head of you. There you go. Originates with Paul. Now look at verse. This is so interesting. And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. It's almost like a communion service because it has those 3 distinct elements where we find these key words. He took bread, gave thanks to God, and broke it and began to eat. one of the primary words and one of the main words for the Lord's Supper or communion is Eucharist, means good grace, good grace. And so they took the bread, and they gave thanks, and they broke it, and they ate. Then they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. When we were in all 276 persons in the ship. Now, there are alternative readings for the 276. There are good manuscripts that say 76. And I go with the 76. The American Bible Society goes with 276, and so most translations will have 276. But there are some good manuscripts that have 76, and a ship, I think, probably, anyway, I'm going to go with the 76. Verse 38. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. Somehow they had made a meal of the wheat. That was the whole purpose of that boat sailing. It was a frumentary ship. It was a big boat. It was an open ocean ship, and so you could just imagine the desperate situation that they're looking at here. And so they had taken when they had taken enough. I don't know what that means, taken enough, but they lightened the ship. So now the owner of the ship, the pilot of the ship, they couldn't have been too happy about it, but saved their life instead. Okay, now we come to the last story, and moving toward the end of chapter 27. Now, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. Now, the island that they found is the island of Malta. And I wish I had a map to show you Malta. But in any way, they find themselves, they had drifted, and they noticed as they approached the island, they approached a beach, a sandy beach, because as I understand it, a lot of the islands in that part of the Mediterranean had rocky shores that you just couldn't pull up, drive your boat, sail your boat into a nice sandy cove and so on. Much of it was rocky, and there were sand shoals. Because of the way the winds blew and the currents of the ocean, there would be around the islands, there would be a lot of shoals made of sand. And there were also reefs. Over the course of time, a lot of the rocky places had been partially devoured, and so they were undersea reefs. It was a very dangerous area, and apparently you had to be very skilled in order to sail. So it says, so they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. So pretty dramatic. This is it. No coming back from this one. We're either going to make it or we're not going to make it. So they're heading in. Let's see. Okay, now, so they cast off the anchors, then hoisting the foresail, that would be in the bow, I assume, to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. They couldn't see it. One commentator said that the wind was probably so strong that they couldn't hear waves coming up against the rocky reefs, and so they didn't know it was there. So they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck, that is, the front of the ship stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. Now, can you imagine these guys? The best and the hardiest among them had to have been scared. Here they are. the wind is just crashing. The waves are just crashing. Early in the morning, it's cold out. We're going to find out a little bit later on. It was cold. And it looked like it was probably raining at the same time. And miserable conditions as you can get. And so here they are. And their boat is being broken up while they're standing on it. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners. Now the soldiers are going to get away. Now to save their lives, another way, they're going to kill the prisoners. They realize if one of the prisoners gets away, they're going to have to pay the price, lest any should swim away and escaped. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. Wow. Okay. Let me look at my notes for just a minute here. Okay. So he ordered those who could swim. This is the centurion Julius. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks. In other words, those who couldn't swim, to rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. It was being broken up. It was a good thing. The wind was, and the waves were bashing the stern of the ship because it broke away some planks of wood, and they could climb on and they could get into land. And so it was. They were all brought safely to land. Wow, all brought safely to land. We got one more program, next week. The last chapter of Acts, verse 28. I'd like to say, well, you can see what happens next. But I want to read as I close out here kind of a preaching point on this experience that they're going on here that had come to my mind when I preached this sermon. In chapter 14 of John's Gospel, these first few verses I would like to read. Jesus says to his disciples, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also." So, the idea is that God was going to make good on his promise. He made good on his promise to bring Paul to Rome. He's going to make good on his promise to bring us to the place where he is. So long.